Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm so sorry for the delay in uploading this video. I lost my voice after getting really sick, but now I'm feeling much better. Thank you so much for all your support. I do hope you guys enjoyed the last video, which was chapters 21 to 25. But if you haven't already seen it, go listen to it before you listen to this one. I'll leave the link in the description below. This will be the next 5 chapters. Before we get started, I would greatly appreciate and love if you guys could subscribe to my channel and also like this video. Also, please feel free to leave a comment down below. I would love to hear from you all. Without further ado, let's get started. 26. Gideon. Gideon left his horse with the stable hand and strode through the gilt doors of Oak Haven Park. A small chandelier winked overhead, sending fractured light over the guests in the front foyer, all of them waiting for staff to pull up their carriages. On the other side of Gideon were twin marble staircases, both leading to the second floor of Octavia Creed's home. Gideon had fought alongside her husband, the good commander, at the New Dawn. The commander was only Nicholas Creed then, a simple soldier in the palace guard. They'd met years ago in a boxing club when Gideon was getting the shit kicked out of him nightly. Those matches always ended the same way, with Gideon hauling his bruised body from the floor of the ring, dragging himself to a table at the bar in the back, and pretending not to notice the sneering men around him, all of them disgusted by his presence. Witch's Hall, they called him. They didn't want Gideon in their ring, but neither would they throw him out, fearing Cressida's wrath. Since they couldn't get rid of him, the men took turns beating Gideon into a pulp night after night, taking out their anger and hate on a target Gideon was happy to provide them. Really, they were doing him a favor. Gideon never told Cressida how he came by the bruises, and she either didn't care or pretended not to. One night, after crawling out of her bed like the insect he was, Gideon noticed a man old enough to be his father watching from across the bar as Gideon drank himself into oblivion before a match. While the other men spat on Gideon when they walked by, this man only stared. He assumed the guy would wait for Gideon to leave, follow him out of the alley, and finish whatever the boys didn't finish in the ring. Sometimes they did that, these men who hated him. He caught the man's eye, welcoming it. When Gideon's match started, he was already high from the laudanum in his blood. His vision blurred and his body swayed, but he could still feel the man's gaze on him. When he lay on the floor afterward, numb despite the punches he'd taken, feeling none of the welts coming up on his skin, unable to taste the blood in his mouth, it was this man who stopped them from dumping Gideon next to the refuse out back where they usually put him. Instead, he helped Gideon over to a private table and ordered him food. As the room spun, Gideon lay his bloody head down on the sticky tabletop, wishing his opponent had broken a bone this time, because maybe then he would feel something. "If one day you wake up and decide you want to hit back," said the man across from him, "come find me." He wrote an address down, pressed it into Gideon's open palm, and folded his limp fingers over the paper. That man was Nicholas Creed. He'd been the only person in that club to see Gideon as something more than a witch's hall. He looked beneath the bruises to the boy with nothing left to live for. It was Nicholas who taught Gideon how to box, showing him he didn't have to take punches, he could throw them, harder and more skillfully than his opponent. It was Nicholas who believed in Gideon when Gideon didn't believe in himself. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now, as he stood in Nicholas's wife's foyer, Gideon buried the memory before he limped up the staircase, following the contented buzz of chattering guests. People stared as he passed, surprised by the captain's presence. He scanned their masked faces, looking for Rune, and moved on when he didn't see her. Gideon wore no mask. While Lila and the others had headed for the docks, he'd gone home to clean and dress the knife wound in his leg, then changed into another one of his father's suits. Gideon didn't own any of his own, and rode straight here. "I hope things went smoothly for you, Gideon." The voice belonged to Charlotte Gong, and it stopped him in his tracks. He turned to find her face half hidden by a rabbit mask. A gold engagement ring gleamed at her neck. Smoothly? He considered asking what she meant, except time was of the essence. He needed to find Rune and arrest her. The moment he stepped in the ballroom, Gideon realized the magnitude of the task before him. There had to be 100 people in here, likely more wandering the grounds, and all of their faces were hidden behind masks. Sighing roughly, Gideon began a sweep starting from the eastern side of the ballroom, keeping to the edges to avoid dancing. He looked for a certain shade of strawberry blonde hair, and when he came up short, he widened his search to include her friend Verity, brown curls, and Alex, tawny hair. They were often at Rune's side, and if he could spot one, the other two would likely be nearby. At the thought of his brother, Gideon paused. If he arrested Rune tonight, he needed to do it without his brother knowing. In private would be best. To do that, he would have to get Rune away from this crowd. He could break the bad news to Alex once it was over. Gideon had started his second sweep of the room when someone called his name. "Citizen Sharp, you made it. I feared you wouldn't." He spun to face the owner of the voice and found a girl in a glittering fox mask staring at him. Someone's suit jacket hung from her shoulders. "Rune?" Her lips were bright red and smiling beneath the cut of the mask, and she braided her hair into a tight knot at the back of her head. It looked darker than its usual red gold hue, as if she'd gotten caught in the rain and it was still damp. Or perhaps fell into a small body of water. His eyes narrowed. Remembering Lila's words from earlier, "I think my last shot hit her." Gideon's attention moved from Rune's face downward, checking her quickly for signs of a wound. His gaze skimmed the fitted bodice of her great dress and the silk gloves covering her arms, but she appeared to be in fine form. Not at all like a criminal who'd raced desperately to get here tonight. Stepping in closer, she laid her hand on his arm. "How did the transfer go?" He frowned. Was she going to pretend tonight hadn't happened? It went exactly as planned. Technically true. He transferred Seraphine Oaks earlier today, after the meeting with Harrow. The witch was locked in a cell deep in the palace prison. Gideon glanced around to see if Alex lurked about, or any of Rune's suitors. He needed to get her alone as soon as possible and make the arrest. "I was telling the girls at Charlotte's luncheon about it," she said, tucking her hand into his elbow and leading him deeper into the room, as if she truly didn't realize he was about to arrest her. Naturally, I would need to give him an update. She smiled up at him, waiting for details. Gideon blinked. "You did what?" If Rune had gossiped away the information he gave her, it meant other people had the same information. Gideon suddenly remembered Charlotte on the stairs. "I hope things went smoothly for you." Seeing his reaction, Rune's hand fell from his elbow. "Oh, was it supposed to be a secret?" She worried one red lip between her teeth. "I should have realized. Drat." His thoughts spun. Rune had told him about the luncheon earlier, before he'd given her the false lead. Knowing how much Rune and her friends loved gossip, he was certain she had spilled the information at her little gathering. How could I be so senseless? She cried. I feel awful. Feeling overly warm, he unbuttoned the collar of his shirt. How many guests were at this luncheon? Hard to say. She twisted her lips. A few dozen, maybe? Knowing the way gossip spread in Vroon's social circles, that number had likely ballooned long before tonight. And if dozens of people knew the location he'd given Vroon as of noon today, any one of them might be the Moth, or in league with her. Anyone could have been at that mine tonight. He stared at Vroon, unsure if she was obtuse or a master of deception. She had drastically widened his net of suspects, but intentionally or unintentionally. Is she actively sabotaging me, or is she innocent? He didn't know, and either way, he could no longer arrest her, not without further evidence. Gideon ground his teeth together. He was back to square one. Vroon, we're leaving now. Are you ready? They turned to find Alex standing several paces away in a crisp white shirt with his usual brown suspenders. It made Gideon realize whose coat hung on Vroon's shoulders. Verity has an exam tomorrow morning, Alex explained to Gideon. He pushed back his lion mask from his face and locked eyes with his brother. The girl in question, Verity DeWild, stood next to Alex, her face half hidden behind a raven mask. She crossed her arms tightly over the bodice of a scarlet dress as she stared down Gideon, like she did not approve of how close he stood to Vroon. What does Verity's exam have to do with you? Gideon asked Vroon. Verity's clipped voice answered for her. Vroon and I came with Alex tonight. He's taking us both home. Oh. Gideon stepped back away from them all. If Vroon had come to this masked ball with his brother, she couldn't have also been in Seldom Harbour. It was another strike against him. Vroon might lie, but Alex wouldn't. His brother would never knowingly sabotage him by aiding a dangerous witch. Not after everything their family had been through. As the three friends turned to leave, Gideon watched Alex press a hand to the small of Vroon's back. At least he's taking my advice. For some strange reason, this didn't make Gideon feel better. It made him feel much worse. 27. Vroon. The carriage bumped and jostled Vroon as Alex's driver took them down the cobbled lanes of the city. Verity and Alex sat facing Vroon, who sat alone on the opposite bench. She should have felt victorious at the look on Gideon's face when he realized she'd turned the tables on him. Instead, she felt drained, like she could sleep for a month straight if given the chance. Maybe that's what I'll do in Kalis, she thought, then caught herself. She still hadn't decided if she was going with Alex, never mind going for a month. An unfamiliar tension radiated between them since leaving the warden's study, and she could feel his eyes on her from the other side of the carriage. What had he been about to say before Verity barged into the room? Let's get a look at this map. Right, the map. Outside, the moon was almost full. It cast just enough light through the windows to see. Sinking down to the floor of the carriage, Vroon pulled out the tracings and unrolled them, piecing them together. Verity and Alex leaned forward to get a better look. There are 7 sections, said Vroon, squinting at the circles she'd traced. A gate marked the entrance to the first and biggest section, the outermost circle. In each concentric circle after it, moving toward the center, were more gates, 7 in total. And each entry was named after one of the 7 ancients: mercy, liberty, wisdom, justice, amity, patience, and fortitude. Vroon remembered when the opera house columns still bore the painted likenesses of the ancients. The images were destroyed by fire when patriots ransacked the building during the revolution. The columns had since been painted over, but Vroon could still picture the renderings of the witches in her mind. Amity, mid-laugh and her hair in a wild tangle, Wisdom with her secretive smile, Justice turning her face toward the sky. Do you know which section they're keeping Seraphine in? Asked Alex. Rune shook her head. Not only did she not know what section or cell Seraphine was in, Rune didn't know how many guards she'd need to evade, or how one passed through the gates, which would be locked. Who held the keys? Once she was on the other side of all the gates, how would she get back out? This feels impossible, said Rune, her shoulders slumping. There's a reason they call it impregnable, said Alex. Unhelpful, said Verity, shooting him a look. She joined Rune on the floor, crossing her legs beneath her dress and leaning over the map as the carriage jolted beneath them. Rune's nose prickled. One of these days she would gently suggest to her friend not to dab so much perfume on. But not tonight. Tonight, if Rune felt exhausted, Verity looked it. There were dark circles under her eyes, and every few minutes her loud yawns broke the silence in the carriage. Not for the first time, Rune felt guilty stealing Verity away from her studies, certain her friend's grades were suffering for it. Verity would scold her if she knew what Rune was thinking. She and Rune were in this together. In it, in a way Alex would never be. Rune had lost her grandmother to the purge. Verity had lost her sisters. Both wanted to rescue as many witches as they could, to make up for the ones they hadn't been able to save. I wish I had a spell for walking through walls, said Rune, leaning her head back against the carriage seat and staring at Alex. Is there such a thing? She shrugged. I've never come across one. Verity pushed her spectacles up the bridge of her nose. I'm sure there's a spell for blasting through walls, but you'll need a lot more blood to pull off that kind of thing. Blood you don't have. She pulled a pencil and notepad from her pocket and started writing. The edge of her tongue popped out of the corner of her mouth as she dutifully made a list. We'll need to know where Seraphine is located, how the gates work, roughly how many guards, how Rune will get out after she gets in, Alex added, sounding displeased but taking part. What day they're planning to purge her, said Rune. This was her last chance. If she arrived too late this time, she wouldn't get another. When she finished her list, Verity lowered her notepad to her knee and started tapping the paper with her pen. That's a lot of information. Lila will know some of these answers, offered Alex. Her mother's the warden, and she's a witch hunter. She'll have been inside that prison more than once. The girl who shot me tonight? Rune arched her brows, remembering the opera house and Lila's less than playful guesses about why she'd been late. Verity seemed to remember the same thing. She shook her head. I don't like the way Lila looks at Rune these days. Best to avoid her. However, mischief danced in her eyes. Her brother might be helpful. Noah's not a witch hunter, Alex pointed out. But his sister is, and his mother is the warden. Noah's smart. He pays attention. And, Verity spoke to Rune now, he's at the top of your list of eligible suitors. If you got him alone... Eligible what? Interrupted Alex. He looked to Rune. What is she talking about? Rune winced, remembering how they excluded Alex from this plan. Deciding it was well past time to fill him in, she said, Verity made a list of eligible men to... No! The ferocity of the word surprised them both. I'll talk to Noah, said Alex, his voice like quiet thunder. I've invited him and bought over 4 cards this week. Rune glanced up to find him glowering at her. What are you going to do? Casually ask him how to get past the gates of his mother's prison? She shook her head. The likelihood of Noah knowing any of these answers, never mind all of them, is so slim. It's not worth the risk of raising his suspicions. Alex opened his mouth to argue, but Rune didn't let him. I already have a better solution. It had been burning inside her this whole time. like a quiet candle flame. She hadn't mentioned it because she knew what they'd say. Verity looked up from her list. Let's hear it. Gideon knows every single one of these answers. If I use my truth-telling spell... You tried that already, Verity pointed out. It didn't work. You tried that already? Alex dragged his hands through his hair. Rune ignored him. It didn't work because he refused the wine, she argued with Verity. But I can fuse the spell to anything. A coat, a shoe, a watch. I could chant a thimble and slip it into his pocket. He wouldn't even know it's there. He'll know, said Alex. He's well acquainted with magic. Not my magic, countered Rune. Every witch's essence is unique. After the trap he'd laid for her, a trap she'd stupidly walked straight into, Rune wanted nothing more than to end things with Gideon. He was altogether too clever. But to cut him loose now, when he suspected her most, would be akin to an admission of guilt. Rune couldn't retreat. She needed to go on the offensive. She had to appear smitten, like she'd never encountered him at that mine tonight. As a Bloodguard captain, Gideon has brought witches through those gates hundreds of times. He'll know where Seraphine is, as well as her purging date. He already suspects you, Rune. He didn't arrest me tonight, she pointed out. She'd bought herself more time with that lunch on. How much time, she didn't know. This didn't seem to soothe them. Rune couldn't exactly blame her friends. She might have outwitted Gideon temporarily, but she hadn't thrown him off her scent for good. All I need is something to enchant, something he'd wear on his person. And the spell mark? Challenged Verity. He'll see it and realize what you are. Then I need to enchant something where I can easily hide a spell mark. I'll figure it out, okay? The Luminary's dinner is in 4 days. I'll ask him to accompany me, and afterward I'll use the spell to get the answers I need from him. Afterward? Said Alex darkly. Verity said nothing. She'd gone utterly quiet. They suddenly both annoyed Rune. Couldn't they see that this was their best option? If either of you come up with a better solution, I'll call the whole thing off. Until then, this is the plan. Alex turned sharply to the carriage window, his fingers twisting that silver ring around and around his smallest finger. Verity merely scowled. After Alex dropped her off at Wintersea House with barely a word of goodbye, Rune dictated a telegram for Lisbeth to handle. Gideon Sharp, 113 Prudence Street, Old Town. Come with me to the Luminary's dinner? Rune. Afterward, she promptly fell into bed, trying not to think about Alex's anger, or his tempting invitation to Kalis, or the tension between them tonight. Fighting with Alex made her feel unbalanced, like a ship they'd been sailing smoothly on for years had suddenly plunged into stormy waters. Alex never blurred the line between his loyalty to Rune and his love for Gideon. He liked to keep them separate. In courting Gideon, Rune was shrinking the gap between those parts of his life, and it was making him anxious. That's all this was. That's why he was being so protective. Rune shook her head. She couldn't afford to be distracted right now, so she put her oldest friend out of her mind and fell asleep. 28. Rune. It was a full day and a half before she received a response from Gideon. Rune was in her casting room working on her luminary speech when Lisbeth interrupted. A package arrived for you. Rune, who was in her middle of spewing extravagant lies onto the page with her pen, asked her to leave it on the desk. Only when she came to the end of the paragraph did she look up. It was a plain white box tied with pale blue ribbons. Wintersea blue, she thought. Eyeing the box, Rune rose to her feet. Stretching the kink in her neck, she rolled her shoulders and shoved aside the speech she was writing, pulling the package closer. Loosening the ribbon, she removed the lid, pushed back the brown paper, and discovered a folded mint green garment inside. Resting on top of it was a note written in black ink. "Are you asking me to be your date? Gideon." Rune read and reread those words before flipping the paper over and looking for more. But that was all he'd written. "Is that a yes?" she wondered. Glancing at the pale green fabric, she set the note aside and pulled out the dress. Something flickered inside her as it unraveled. Her pulse sped up as she took in the tapered lace sleeves and the delicately embroidered bodice. After loosening the laces, Rune stripped out of her clothes and stepped into the elegant dress. The silk was smooth as water against her skin, and the lace sleeves fit her arms like gloves. Without someone to do the laces up, she'd left the back open, stepped into the matching silk shoes the dress had arrived with, and walked into her bedroom to stand before the full-length mirror. Her heart nearly lodged in her throat. The mint green and white lace complemented her pale complexion and brought out the shades of red in her hair. As her fingers traced the almost imperceptible pattern of the waves across the bodice, Rune tried to remind herself how much she loathed the boy who made it. But it was the most beautiful dress she'd ever seen, never mind worn, and Rune couldn't stop the startling warmth rippling through her. She'd wished she'd asked Lisbeth to stay, to tie the laces so it would fit properly. Wading back to her desk in the casting room, tools swishing around her legs, Rune sank into the chair, grabbed a pen and pad of paper, and jotted down a response. "Gideon Sharp, 113 Prudence Street, Old Town. Yes, Gideon. I'm asking you to be my date. Rune. P.S. My plan is to win you over so you'll keep making me dresses forever. P.P.S. Let me know when it's working." She found it hard to concentrate after that and was almost relieved when Lisbeth interrupted again. Rune had moved from writing her speech at her desk to reciting it as she paced the room. "Miss Rune?" Lisbeth glanced over her shoulder and stepped into the casting room. "There's a visitor here to see you. He's in the foyer." Rune, who wasn't expecting any callers, looked up from the page she was reading. "Who is it?" Lisbeth lowered her voice. "That Blood Guard captain." "Gideon?" Rune's eyes widened. What could he want? "Tell him..." She was still wearing the dress he'd made her, the laces down the back undone. "Tell him I'll be right down, and maybe offer some refreshments." Lisbeth nodded, then disappeared. Darn, she'd purchased a suit jacket for Gideon in town yesterday, to enchant with truth teller and to atone for the one she'd ruined with wine. Not that she could ever truly atone for ruining a sharp duet jacket. Even now, the memory stabbed her with guilt. To fit him, though, the seamstress needed to make a few adjustments. So Rune didn't have the jacket in her hands, and therefore couldn't use it to get information. "It's fine," she told herself, shrugging off the dress. "Just make yourself presentable and go down there." Rune reached for the clothes she'd cast off earlier, only to find them wrinkled from lying in a heap. Needing something else to wear, Rune ran to her wardrobe and pulled on the first thing she found. A simple cotton sundress that fell to her knees. She hurried barefoot down the stairs and immediately slowed upon seeing the young man in her foyer. Gideon faced away from her, clasping his hands behind his back as he eyed his surroundings. He wore plain brown trousers and had rolled his shirt sleeves to his elbows, showing off his forearms. Rune's heart stumbled at the sight of him. This was the same boy who had her pinned beneath him 2 nights ago, the same boy she'd stabbed in the leg with the knife. "Gideon," she said, recovering. "What a pleasant surprise." He spun to face her, and Rune quailed a little beneath his penetrating gaze. How much did he remember from the mine? It had been so dark down there. Even when he lit the flare, he hadn't removed her hood in time to see her. But could he still know, somehow, that it was her? Her legs felt like jelly. Rune gripped the railings a little too hard and kept descending the stairs. "What brings you to Wintersea?" "I came to ask if you would like to take a walk with me." Walk? You said there's a beach near here. He seemed uncertain suddenly and unclasped his hands. If you're busy. Oh, yes. I mean, no, not busy. Yes, there is a beach. She reached the bottom of the steps, weirdly out of breath. A walk would be lovely. Great, he said. Why are you really here? She wondered. She tried a smile, then glanced toward Lisbeth, who entered the foyer with the knit shawl in her hands. Taking it, Rune flung it over her shoulders. Rune and Gideon stood awkwardly for a moment before she realized he didn't know the way to the beach he'd never been to. Right, her cheeks reddened. Follow me. She led him through the house, and only once they'd entered the gardens did she wonder if she should have strapped on her knife. 29. Gideon. Gideon slowed his stride to match Rune's as she led him through the labyrinth hedges. She carried a lantern in one hand as they walked through her gardens, while her other hand clasped her shawl closed at her throat. Her hair was loose, and the breeze kept tugging strands across her face, giving him the infuriating urge to drag it back with his fingers. No paint adorned her lips tonight. No rouge reddened her cheeks. Even her feet were bare. She looked wild and raw and exposed out here. Not the girl he was used to seeing all done up at parties. It threw him off guard. He'd come here to win back her trust because she was his best lead, but he found himself faltering, unsure of himself. The silence between them rose like a crescendo. He glanced down at the angry gash on her forearm. How did a girl who spent her days planning parties and spreading gossip come by such a deep wound? Did you hurt yourself? Rune startled. Oh, yes, I took a stumble while riding yesterday. Sliced my arm on a rock. I can be so clumsy. She smiled up at him, tucking the arm under her shawl and changing the subject. Have you given more thought to my invitation? To the Luminaries' dinner? I thought my answer was obvious. She glanced at him, her lips parting. Apparently it was not. He almost laughed. Rune, of course I'll accompany you. You expected me to turn you down? Her eyes held his. I don't know what to expect with you. The words hung in the air between them. Was that Rune Winters talking, or the Crimson Moth? Gideon had no proof that she and the moth were the same. Rune had a solid alibi last night, and yet she was freshly injured, much like the moth might be after Lila shot at her. He couldn't arrest her, but neither was he convinced of her innocence. It was why he was here. If Rune was the moth, no way would she trust him after the stunt he'd pulled at the Seldom mine. He needed to patch the hole he'd made, because the only way to unmask her was to get closer to her. And the only way to do that was to convince her to trust him again, if that was even possible. What would I do if this were a real courtship? Gideon recoiled at the thought. He didn't know how to fall for someone as superficial as Rune Winters. Maybe that was the wrong way to think about it. How would he fall for a girl pretending to be superficial in order to outwit him? That was easier. Gideon cleared his throat. Your gardens are beautiful. He winced, imagining Harrow rolling her eyes. Is that the best you can do, lover boy? Are they? Rune murmured, taking in her surroundings. I try to keep them well tended, but I lack my grandmother's devotion. She loved these flowers like they were her children. At the mention of Kestrel, Rune's face softened. She continued unprompted as her gaze roamed the hedges. Sometimes, if I squint, I can almost see her still trimming her roses, or sipping tea in the greenhouse with her box of seed packets beside her, planning out the next season's garden. She quickly glanced at Gideon, her face blanching, as if she'd said more than she'd meant to. We never had a garden, he said to put her at ease. But my mother grew herbs in a box on the windowsill. He immediately wished he'd thought of something else to say. His family's lack of land was an obvious reminder of the gap between them, their stations, their upbringings, their lives. It was a gap that had narrowed since the revolution, but it would never close. Proving him exactly right, she said, "You could have a garden now if you wanted. You could live somewhere far grander than the Wintersea house, with gardens more well-kept as a reward for everything you did for the Republic. I'm sure the good commander would grant it all to you if you asked." "I'm happy in Old Town." "Are you?" Gideon flinched at her question, remembering the day he took her measurements in her parents' shop. He wondered what she'd been thinking as she walked the sooty streets of his neighborhood, breathing in the smoggy air, listening to the rattle and hiss of factories nearby. "Old Town didn't impress you, I take it?" She stiffened beside him. "I only meant, was that your first time there?" She didn't need to answer, he could easily guess. In all the years Rune and Alex had been friends, she'd never set foot in their tenement. Alex had always gone to Wintersea House. Either his brother had been too ashamed to invite her into their home, or he had invited her and Rune had declined to come. "When my parents died, the shop and apartment passed to me," he explained. "But why do you choose to live there? Why not sell it and ask the commander for an estate of your own? Thornwood Hall, for example, could have been yours." Thornwood Hall. Gideon shivered. A dark shadow hung over that house. He could still feel Cressida there, still smell the stench of her magic in the air. The few times he'd gone back, he'd been plagued by living nightmares. "I would rather sleep beneath a bridge than sleep in Thornwood Hall," he said, more to himself than to her. "If you found Old Town beneath you, I certainly won't admit to the neighborhood we live in before that." "I never said Old Town was beneath me." Her voice came from several paces behind him, making him realize she'd stopped walking. Turning to face her, he found her edges lit up by the red gold light of the setting sun and her white sundress whipping around her knees in the wind. They were at the edge of the gardens here. The hedges were lower and less manicured. Wild, like her. "Your neighborhood is quaint." Quaint is a word polite people use when they don't want to be insulting. Her cheeks reddened, and her hair blew across her face. "Are you so determined to misunderstand me?" Gideon paused, studying her. If he and Rune Winters were truly courting, which would never happen, this is exactly the argument he would have with her. Is it quaint that the residents of Old Town scrape their pennies together to keep the lights on? Quaint that parents spend half the year starving so their children don't have to? When penitent children beg in Old Town streets, or the old and infirm freeze to death in their beds because they can't afford to heat their apartments? These things were regular occurrences in Old Town. Rune stared in horror at Gideon. Of course she didn't know about these things. She lived in a different world, one that was only an hour's ride on horseback, but might as well as be as far as the moon. Gideon turned and kept walking, annoyed with himself for bringing it up, annoyed at her for being, well, her. "I'm not sure why you're angry at me," she said to his back. "If penitent children are begging in the street, it's the Republic you should blame. The good commander made their families outcast for aiding witches." Gideon stopped. "Or don't you remember that the commander promised us a better world?" she continued before he could respond. "One where no one lives in squalor." Despite his anger, she was right. Gideon remembered the rallies, the speeches, the pamphlets hidden in pockets and shoes or between the pages of books passed under the noses of the aristocracy. Nicholas Creed had promised to usher in a better world, but that world had yet to fully arrive. "If people live in poverty," she said, "you should direct your anger at him." He whirled on her. You think we weren't impoverished before? You have no idea what the real world is like, Rune. You live a pampered, privileged existence and always have. I'm not saying that's your fault. I'm simply stating facts. If you don't want to look at ugly things, you don't have to. You can pretend they don't exist. A bright flush of red swept up her neck. People like you and your grandmother flourished under the reign of witches, when things were worse than they are now. So don't pretend you care. You didn't then, and you don't now. The sister queens or the good commander. It's all the same to you. She winced as if he'd struck her. Seeing it, the fight went out of him. That was too far. Rune. He ran his hands roughly through his hair. I'm sorry. Did he have to be so brutally honest? She seemed so small suddenly. He wanted to close the space between them, but was afraid she might recoil. I agree with you. The revolution was supposed to make things better for all of us, but there's a long way to go. She stayed silent, watching him as the wind whipped through her hair. I've ruined it, he thought. She's going to turn around and go back and never speak to me again. But instead of trying to salvage this, his last fraying thread to his only lead on the Crimson Moth, he gave her that out. He felt sick with himself for insulting her, and the right thing to do was suggest they return to the house. Before he could, she stepped toward him, stopping only inches away. If I thought you were beneath me, her eyes were hard as pewter searching his. Why would I be out on a walk with you? He searched hers back. Why indeed? Lifting his hands, he gathered the wild tangle of hair blowing across her face. It surprised him when she didn't flinch away, when she let him scrape it back instead. She seemed to soften as he held it, allowing him to see her clearly. He shouldn't have liked it so much. The feel of her hair against his palms, the way she relaxed beneath his fingers. Beautiful heiresses might court common soldiers, he said, but they don't marry them. Her mouth quirked a little. Did you just call me beautiful, Gideon? I'm stating the obvious. Don't change the subject. She looked away. You know it's true, Rune. People of your station don't marry down. In Gideon's experience, those born into wealth and privilege wanted more of it, not less. Like the first hit of a drug, the moment people tasted power, they needed more to quench the craving. I don't know how to dance your songs, he said. I don't have the esteem of your friends. I don't use 17 pieces of silverware at dinner. He let go of her hair and it billowed out, catching in the wind once more. I have no means of expanding your inheritance. He knew he was walking a fine line, reminding her of the reasons they made no sense, that the charade they were playing was a weak one. But if the goal was to be vulnerable, to entice her to be vulnerable too, he needed to speak the truth. People like you are impossible. I don't care about those things. He almost rolled his eyes. Of course you do. Then why are we here? If I'm so shallow, all trappings and no substance, what are you doing with me? Why would someone like you want someone like me? Gideon opened his mouth to respond, only he didn't know the answer. He studied her, hair ablaze in the setting sun, grey eyes like molten steel. In his silence, Rune came to her own conclusions. Maybe you're right. She stepped around him, lantern in hand, and unlatched the white gate at the garden's edge, stepping into the meadow beyond. One of us thinks ourselves too good for the other, but it's not me. The gate swung closed behind her. Gideon stared after her. What? From this side of the gate, he watched her follow the footpath through the tall grass, heading toward the woods in the distance. For some strange reason, his thoughts trickled to Cressida. He'd learned very quickly not to challenge Cress. Arguments with her came with consequences. When he disagreed or disobeyed, she would punish him, and sometimes others, until he stopped resisting her altogether. Rune, on the other hand, seemed rattled by his insults, but unfazed by his defiance. It was uncharted territory, and without a map to guide him, Gideon stood motionless, watching her get farther away. Not even Harrow's voice in his head was of any help. If you genuinely liked this girl, he told himself, you would go after her. Hopping over the gate, Gideon jogged down the path after her, his pulse beating wildly. As a general rule, Gideon avoided situations that rendered him vulnerable. Yet here he was, running straight into one. If we're going to do this, he said when he caught up with her, there are some things you need to know. She glanced at him. So you can decide if this is what you want, if I am what you want. The forest ahead obscured their view of the sea, but he could taste the brine on the breeze. They were getting close. She studied him in the light shining from her lantern. All right, tell me. This is a game, he reminded himself, his chest tight. It means nothing. But if that were true, why did he feel like he was walking straight off a cliff, hoping he wouldn't fall? 30. Gideon. The last girl I fell in love with was a witch, he said. Rune stiffened beside him. I met her the day my parents became royal dressmakers. His mother's designs had been catching the eye of the aristocracy for nearly a year. Several months before, the money from their growing business had allowed them to move out of the outer wards, the poorest district in the capital, and into a tenement building in Old Town. In a day, the queens had elevated them much further, moving their family into the palace. Suddenly, they could afford Alex's tuition. Suddenly, Gideon no longer needed to skip meals, so his little sister, Tessa, could eat her fill. My parents could hardly keep up with the Queen's demands, so they brought me in to help. Alex had left to study at the conservatory, and Tessa was too young to do anything except get in the way. Cressida asked that I be assigned to her exclusively, so I went to live at Thornwood Hall. His stomach churned as he tried to decide how much to unearth. He didn't want Rune to know every sordid deal of his past, but there were things she deserved to know before she entangled herself with him further. Cress didn't only want me for her tailor. He darted a glance at Rune, who walked beside him, staring straight ahead, and I was happy to fulfill her other needs. You two were intimate, you mean? Yes. He wanted to block out the memories flooding in. Late nights in Cressida's gardens that somehow always ended in her bed, his fingers tracing the silvery casting scars she proudly displayed on her skin like the most exquisite art. Each casting scar had been etched by Cressida or her sisters, the collection like a wild garden growing up her body. Scar lines formed roses and lilies, buttercups and irises, all tangled with leaves and thorns and stems. The silver flowers climbed her calves and thighs, covering the left side of her torso and breast, and flowed down her arms. Gideon's favorites were the petal-shaped scars scattered across her collarbone. She'd completely bewitched him. He spared Rune all of this. It didn't take long before things went wrong. What do you mean? Rune's voice pulled him out of the memory. They were in the woods now, and like in the meadow behind him, someone had cleared a path through the trees. The leaves glowed gold in the haze of the setting sun. My mother became unwell. He remembered her bruised and bleeding fingers, her red-rimmed eyes, and the way her bones poked out of her skin. She started seeing things that weren't there and accused my father and me, even Tessa, of things we hadn't done. Stealing her notebooks, ruining her fabrics, sabotaging her in every way. His muscles bunched at the memories. His mother accused them of worse things too. Her husband of being unfaithful to her, Tessa of poisoning her, Gideon of abusing Tessa. Nightmarish things. things that still kept him awake at night, and always he could smell it on her, the coppery scent of a witch's spells. The sister queens were slowly torturing her. "That makes no sense," said Rune. "If they wanted your mother as their dressmaker, why torment her?" He threw Rune a look. "You obviously didn't know the Rosebloods. Witches are cruel by nature, but the Roseblood sisters were evil. They tortured and killed those who crossed them, then used the blood of their victims for their spells." Rune shook her head in disbelief. "That's impossible." "I saw it with my own eyes." "No, I mean," she shook her head, "what you're describing are arcana spells, which are forbidden. Queen Rain outlawed them centuries ago." He glanced at her, surprised that she knew this, but her grandmother had been a witch. Of course she would know things about witchcraft. "An arcana is the highest level of spell a witch can cast," she explained. "They require blood taken against someone's will. The magic that results is powerful and deadly, but it corrodes the witches who use it. If the Roseblood sisters were casting arcanas, they would have knowingly corrupted themselves." It reminded Gideon of something Cressida had said years ago when he walked in on her and her sisters standing over a body in a pool of blood. The sight of it, combined with the strong stench of magic, had almost made him vomit. "The more power we wield, Gideon, the more they want to see us fall. What are we to do? Let those who hate us plot our demise? To play by the rules when everyone else disregards them? That is foolishness. Once you've seized power for yourself and those you love, you must do everything to keep it, even sacrifice your soul. If you don't, you'll watch your loved ones harmed by those wanting what you have." Rune fell silent beside him. For several minutes, the only sounds in the wood were their footsteps crunching on the pine needle path and the wind rustling the forest canopy. This next part would be the hardest to get through. Gideon glanced at Rune, trying to justify skipping it, but if this were a real courtship, he would want her to know. "One of us thinks ourselves too good for the other, but it's not me." He was certain to put her words to the test. If they didn't hold true, he certainly wouldn't blame her. "When I told Cressida we were done, that I wanted nothing more to do with her, she warned that if I refused her advances, my little sister would suffer my mother's fate. I was terrified of her by then, and I desperately wanted to spare Tessa, so I did whatever she asked." He ran a hand roughly through his hair. "She killed Tessa anyway." "I thought your sister died of the sweating sickness," said Rune. "It's what Alex must have told her." "Do you remember the party where I poured you tea? Cress convinced herself that I was cheating on her with the handmaid and wanted to punish me. When she realized that serving tea wasn't humiliating for me, she changed tactics, telling me I had to prove my devotion by making her 3 dozen silk roses by sunrise, the kind my father used to make for my mother, and if I failed, something terrible would happen to my little sister." He looked down at Rune, who drew her lips in a tight line. "The silk flower I made you took me 2 hours to sew." Rune's eyes went dark doing the math. By the time the sun rose, Gideon had somehow sewn 12 roses. To Cress, this was further proof that he wasn't sorry enough. That same day, she used a spell to strike his little sister with the sweating sickness. Cress locked Tessa in her room and refused to let anyone tend to her. Gideon threw himself at the door, which Tessa had enchanted to hold against all force, beating it with his fists while Tessa wept and begged from the other side, delirious with fever, calling for their mother. He screamed at Tessa, who only smirked, so he lunged and pinned her down. He had his hands around her throat, prepared to stop squeezing only when she went limp beneath him, but the guards dragged him off and chained him to the floor of the cell. By the time they let him out, Tessa was dead. My mother drowned herself a day later. My father hung himself a few days after that. And still, she wasn't satisfied. His hands fisted. I knew there was one last person she could hurt, if I didn't do as she asked. Your brother, murmured Rune. Gideon nodded. Alex had been the last unspoken threat hanging between him and the Witch Queen. He'd started drinking after that, every day, sometimes as soon as waking up. It was the only way he could bear crawling back to her bed every night. Sometimes it felt like Cressida preferred Gideon unwillingly, like it brought her more pleasure to force him. He recalled the night she branded him. She'd pinned him to the wall with a spell so he'd be helpless to stop her from searing his flesh. He remembered his body spasming beneath the glowing iron, every muscle tightening at the lightning-hot pain. It's a curse, Gideon, she said, pressing harder as he tried not to scream. One I will activate if you betray me again. That's why Alex killed her, murmured Rune. Gideon heard the hush of waves in the distance. The smell of the sea was strong here, and when the trees thinned, he saw the gentle roll of the dunes. As they emerged from the woods, he could see the entire shoreline stretched out before them. There was a causeway to the east, separating the shallow bay from the open sea beyond, where the water shimmered turquoise beneath a pink sky. I've spoiled a perfect evening, he said, awed by the view. He wanted to dive in and let the sea wash over the stain he could never scrub clean. But as he started toward the water, Rune grabbed his hand to stop him. You've spoiled nothing. He looked down to find their fingers entwined. When he glanced back, her eyes held a storm so fierce it took his breath away. You are not the things that happened to you, Gideon. He wished that was true. None of us can escape our pasts. Gideon's past had shaped him, haunted him, ruined him. Everything he did on the eve of the new dawn, helping Nicholas Creed and the other rebels take the palace, shooting Annalise and Elwyn in their beds, hunting down Cressida only to be stopped by Alex, who had found and dealt with her so Gideon didn't have to. He did it all because of what the Witch Queens did to him and his family. It was why he hunted witches still, because so many had it as bad or worse than him. Harrow was only one example. Witches were wicked to the core. If given enough power, they would abuse it. To stop them from rising again, to ensure no one was ever at their mercy, every witch needed to be eradicated. At that thought, Gideon pulled his hands free of Rune's, remembering why he was here. He suspected Rune Winters was a witch hiding in plain sight. To catch her, he needed proof. And there was one telltale sign every witch carried on them. He remembered tracing Cressida's silvery scars in the dark while she slept. Remembered Harrow's advice from 2 nights ago. The sun was slipping below the horizon. Soon it would be gone, and the only light remaining would come from the small lantern in Rune's hand. Before the darkness descended, Gideon unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of his shirt. Rune's forehead creased. What are you doing? Going for a swim. Now? The water's calm, the night is warm. Perfect conditions for swimming. When the shirt was loose enough, he tugged it off and dropped it into the sand between them. Whatever objection Rune was about to make died on her lips. At her startled expression, Gideon nearly laughed. He cocked a brow at her. You coming?